הבהרה, התוכן המשודר מבוסס על עדויות אישיות של מרואיינים אשר נאמרו על דעתם בלבד. אין לראות בתוכן משום המלצה כלשהי לרבות המלצה רפואית ו/או נפשית, ואין לראות בו משום עידוד לביצוע פעולות כלשהן.
Iands Israel. החיים שאחרי החיים.
שלום וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט המצולם של Iands Israel. היום יש איתנו שני אורחים מאוד מיוחדים. דוקטור ריימונד מודי הוא חוקר שבמשך 50 שנה חקר את תופעת חוויית סף מוות. הוא טבע את המונח חוויית סף מוות, Near Death Experience, וליסה סמארט היא גם חוקרת בפני עצמה, היא בלשנית, פרופסורית, שניהם עובדים יחד ב10 שנים האחרונות.
הם הקימו את האוניברסיטה של גנדה, ויש לנו הרבה מה לספר. הם עשו מחקר משותף לגבי אנשים שחוו חוויות סף מוות, והמילים האחרונות שהם אומרים לפני שהם בעצם עוברים מעולם הזה, והם בדקו האם יש דפוס והאם יש משמעות משותפת, ונשמע עוד מושגים חשובים ועוד מידע עם שני האנשים האלה שהם בעצם יש להם כל כך הרבה מידע לתת לנו, וזה כבוד גדול. Hello, Dr. Raymond and Lisa.
Hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
First, I just wanted to know how the two of you met, and if you could tell us a little bit about how you founded the University of Heaven.
I read Raymond Moody's book when I was 17 years old, which was a few years ago. and I actually remember the exact moment I was lying on my rug in my bedroom, and I just was amazed by what I read. And I never in my life thought that I would be working with him, or I would have a personal as well as professional relationship with him. So that was when I was 17, and then many years, 35 years later, I had a degree in linguistics. I was doing research and also running a literacy program for adults, and then my father started to die. And as my father was dying, I noticed fascinating changes in his language, and since my training was in linguistics, I became very, very curious about what was going on with him, and I sat next to him as he was dying and wrote down his words and was intrigued by what I heard. And while I was feeling the grief about my father dying, I was also feeling the curiosity of what I was seeing before me, which were changes in his language. And when my father passed away, I became very curious about what I had witnessed. And I went up this street to the University of California in Berkeley, where I went to school, and to find out more about the language of people as they die. And there was nothing there. So I just started reading everything I could, because there had been no research before about the language or the linguistics of end of life. And I was at Temple one day, and someone came up to me and said, "So how are you doing after your dad's passing?" And I said, I'm very sad, and I'm also very curious about final words, because I saw these changes in my father's language. And this person said to me, "I'm going to be teaching a workshop with Raymond Moody in a few weeks. Would you be interested in maybe coming? Because, it's Raymond Moody." And I thought, yes, but I don't have the money. So a few days later, I went to my mailbox and I got my income tax return for $2,100. And I took it as a sign. And I took that money to use to fly, because it was far away from me, to fly away and go to Raymond Moody's workshop and study with him for that week. And about 4 days into the seminar, Raymond started talking about language and mentioned final words. And I got very excited. And I would say, that was my version of what happened. And then I said, "Final words, I need to know everything there is about final words. And I have a background in linguistics, and would you help me?" And he said, what did you say, Raymond?
Yes, I, even though my work on near-death experiences is what I'm known for, And also I'm a medical doctor, so often people put those two things together. But actually, the way I got interested in near-death experiences was that I was a philosophy major and then later a PhD in philosophy. And since the age of 18, I've been fascinated by ancient Greek philosophy, which is still one of my favorite subjects. And my specific area of interest in philosophy was philosophy of language and logic. And my specific interest, the main interest in philosophy of language, has to do with nonsense. That is, language which is unintelligible, things that just, even though they're language and yet they don't make sense. For example, when you say, "'Twas brilliant the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave," or when you say, "Holiness pursues the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity," or when you say, "That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this town." And I had been fascinated by this literally since I was a kid, because I was an astronomy buff from the age of 7 years old, and I quickly realized that this thing we're in doesn't make any sense, right? Because you want to know, how big is this thing we're in? So your mind goes out to the wall, right? But then doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? So it doesn't make any sense to say that the universe ends in a wall, but it doesn't make any sense to say that it goes on and on and on forever either. So that was what brought me to consciousness when I was about 7 years old. Since the age of 7 or 8, I've been fascinated with what makes something nonsensical. And it was I studied this all through graduate school in philosophy. My dissertation in philosophy had to do with this question of unintelligible language, or what makes something unintelligible, which is a very big concept in analytic philosophy. Now, I heard about these near-death experiences in Plato at the age of 18, and I became interested in them. I met a living person, Dr. George Ritchie, who had had such an experience in 1965 when I was 20 years old. And subsequently just kept interviewing people who had been to the brink of death. And so when I went to medical school in 1972 with this background, one of the first things I noticed when I was on the wards as a medical student was how very often patients who are ill for various reasons, delirium or intoxications with various substances such as mercury, or people who are schizophrenic, or who are just people under severe stress, will often talk nonsense. And so the interesting observation I made, by this time I had sort of cataloged the different types of nonsense. In this context, I had realized I dealt a lot with terminally ill patients, and because you know, back in the 1970s, people didn't like to talk about death. So when I was on my wards in my medical school career, my attendings, the physicians who were supervising me, realized that I was interested in death and I could talk to people who were dying. So it tended to be that I got all the patients who were terminally ill. They gave me lots of patients who were terminally ill. And in that context, I began to realize, as is a common observation of many physicians, that just in the last few days and weeks of life, people talk nonsense. And I began to think that it's possible that we could track the mind of a dying patient as that person goes into the terminal state. And if, as I assume, that dying is associated with a transcendent state of consciousness, that we will actually be able to follow the human mind into the transcendent state of dying. And that was what was in my mind when I was talking that day about that phenomenon, and it sort of jived with Lisa, and that was the beginning of our association, although it's turned into a great friendship, and almost like, as I said, I feel like Lisa is a relative more than a friend.
So there is this dictionary of certain words they say before they die?
Well, I would say that that the structure of the language of the dying, even though it sounds unintelligible, is rationally discernible. One of the great paradoxes of human thought, and this is something that Aristotle kind of missed, and so therefore that skews the logic that we use in the West, is that whereas Plato had been trying to figure out the depth structure of meaningless, unintelligible language, namely nonsense, he wrote a whole dialogue about it. And he realized that nonsense too has its own structures, just like meaningful, literal, or figurative language. And so Aristotle, however, was kind of a person, I think he was probably severely obsessional, and anything that smacked of the irrational to him was just out of it. So when he codified logic, he left out nonsense. Aristotle's favorite word for nonsense is random talk. The common sense view is that if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, the common sense view is that nonsense is down here. It's something sublinguistic. But once you start thinking about it, you see that the contrary is true, that actually nonsense is something supralinguistic. It's in effect, a higher level of language that's superimposed over the language, ordinary meaningful language. I know that sounds, you can think through it and see it for yourself. And so what does this have to do with near-death experience?
Could it be that when people use these different structures of language before they're passing over, does it show a change in their consciousness? Could it be related to that?
Yes. I am convinced on many grounds that people who lapse into transcendent states of consciousness are necessarily compelled to talk nonsense about it if they are going to say anything about it, right? Because it's people who have mystical experiences or near-death experiences. The most common thing they say is, however well-educated or articulate or however many languages they may speak, they say there are no words. William James, the psychologist, categorized this as ineffability. He said that people who have a profound transcendent state of consciousness, they say there are no words for it. And so if you feel nonetheless compelled to talk about it, when you have a near-death experience, you want to tell others about it. At least most people do want to express it. But since it's ineffable, they have to resort to some other mode of language to express it. And I think that's what people with near-death experiences do. If you think about the structure of the average account of a near-death experience, it's a travel narrative, right? Mm-hmm. I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I returned to my body and came back to life. Now, that is a travel narrative. However, what people say about their near-death experience is that it did not take place in time, right? They say, I saw everything I'd ever done in my life, but no time passed. And they say it was not in space, that this state of consciousness does not take place in the time and the space dimension of the 3D space. And so the question is, what meaning does a travel narrative have if you subtract the idea of time and space? You see? So what that means is that it's a nonsensical travel narrative. But as long as we think there's something bad with nonsense, then that is a stumbling block. I think the first step in investigating these experiences has to take account of the fact that the verbal expression of it is, at least in 2021, necessarily to be unintelligible. It makes sense that if somebody goes over to another state of existence and comes back from it, they would have to talk nonsense to explain it to us, right?
And it was Raymond's, Raymond's interest in nonsense and knowing that nonsense had its own structure or organization that led in a way to him discovering or discerning the near-death experience. Because what was happening is other physicians and nurses and so forth would hear people come back from the near-death experience and say something like, I've never been as alive as when I was dead, which makes no sense. That's nonsense. And most people are like, oh, the person's crazy, you know, they're just on medications. But Raymond was like, wait, let's track these patterns, because he, like I, had a very profound respect for language and knows that it's not random, or it's, what was the expression used, random order, right? So, yes. So Raymond began to transcribe what people said that everyone else said was nonsense. And when he started writing down what people were saying about tunnels or leaving their body, suddenly the very things that sounded like nonsense, these patterns emerged, right? Here's all, and that is why, that's the near-death experience came from discerning the patterns. So the same thing with words at the threshold. As people are dying, there is all this language that looks like just complete chaos, but actually there are certain kind of patterns that occur with nonsense, and that is this incredible contribution that Dr. Moody has given to us.
It's like trying to find the patterns in the chaos.
Exactly, and physics is a good example, because if you look at the history of science, nonsense has served as a placeholder or a stopgap. And I guess the famous example of it these days, it would be the fact that the two most powerful explanatory theories in physics ever devised have been the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. However, as is often pointed out, if you integrate the equations of those two systems, the result is unintelligible nonsense, right? So that means that, as in so many other cases, nonsense is a placeholder. And it's, if you go back in your mind to the year 1915, okay? And be an intelligent, well-educated person of the year 1915. And now listen to these following three sentences. Sentence number 1, all 4 of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's unintelligible. Now add the knowledge of the role of DNA in genetics, the possibility of gene splicing, gene editing, and cloning, and we can imagine a scenario which makes that intelligible, right? You could send a probe down and get the DNA, and it hasn't happened yet, but it could. It's what was unintelligible in 1915 is intelligible in 2021. Or listen to this. 2 women got married to each other at City Hall yesterday. In 1915, unintelligible. Today, it's the law of the land. Or listen to this one, go back to 1915 and hear this sentence. I watched a movie on my phone this morning. Unintelligible in 1915. So unintelligibility is not a static concept. And I think that the notion of life after death, which is technically unintelligible in 2021, is rapidly reaching a point where it will be intelligible. I realized a long time ago, even when I was when I was a philosophy professor, that if you train people in advance and teach them how to think logically about meaningless, unintelligible language, namely nonsense, and then you have enough people who have gone through that experience, then the time clock starts, and eventually some of those people are going to have near-death experiences, right? And so then they will be able to articulate this experience in a brand new way. Now, we already have thousands of cases of near-death experiences articulated through the lens of Aristotelian literal logic, which makes it a travel narrative. I say that in the not too distant future, we will have lots of other accounts of near-death experiences articulated not just through the lens of Aristotelian logic, but in addition to these supplementary logical principles of how to think about nonsense. And that gives us what astronomers call parallax. That is two different levels of, two different angles of looking at the notion of an afterlife. You know, we hear all the time it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri. But have you ever stopped to think, well, how do they know that? I mean, they can't tie a odometer on a homing pigeon's leg and send it out there, right? So the way they know is that they knew that the distance across the orbit of the Earth around the sun is 186 million miles. So when the Earth was here in its orbit, the angle to certain nearby stars was carefully measured. Wait 6 months when it's on the opposite side and the angle is measured again, and you can see there would be a minute difference. And that gives the distance out to Alpha Centauri. What I've come up with is a corresponding method to look at the afterlife. We can now look at it in two different languages. And to my great delight, it's happened once. And I think in the future it will happen again. A wonderful man who's an eminent sculptor and scientist years ago was in one of my seminars on nonsense and how to think about nonsense. Several years later, he had a near-death experience from H1N1. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks, almost died, had several near-death experiences during the time. And when he came back and told me about it, he said, while I was over there on the other side, he said, my mind went back to your seminar, and he said, and I realized that what you're saying is true, that we can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless, and he said, unless we take the unintelligibility axis into account. So this gives us a whole new way of looking at this very, very important question. I was not raised religious, by the way. I just, the idea of an afterlife is still very counterintuitive to me. I mean, my interest was astronomy. So this has been a long process for me to come to. I always realized, by the way, that this idea that this is oxygen deprivation to the brain, that doesn't work. For example, in my first year in medical school, one of my own professors told me that when she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her own mother, and she said, I felt it when my mother died, but the professor herself got out of her body and went, she could see the scene from down below. She saw her mother there with her in spirit form. She saw her mother recede into this tunnel and be met by spirits of relatives and friends who had died, of her mothers. And then my professor came back and rejoined her own body. My professor was not ill or injured. There was no question of an oxygen deprivation to her brain, and yet she had the same experience. And I've heard hundreds of these where bystanders at the death of someone else have all of the experiences that we equate to a near-death experience, and yet they are not ill or injured. So some other factor or factors are involved here. And I have no interest whatsoever in persuading anybody else of my own opinion, but to tell you the truth, I'm just sort of backed in. I don't know what else to say, except to my utter astonishment, I think there is life after death.
You talked now about shared death experiences.
Well, I realized fairly early in my career that it's fairly common that people who are there at the bedside when somebody else dies will have all of these elements that we equate with the near-death experience, even though they themselves are not ill or injured. For example, people at the bedside of a dying loved one will say that as their grandmother in the bed, for example, dies, that the one or more of the bystanders will say that they feel they leave their body and they accompany their dying relative into this light. And at some point they say that they come back to their own bodies and their loved one has passed away. Or people at the scene of when someone is dying will say that the room fills with light, this ethereal light, which is not from a light bulb or from the sun, but seems to come from within. Or I've heard many people say that as a loved one dies, they saw the apparitions of the dying person's deceased relatives come into the room. And also the one that is most shocking to me, and I must say this is the most shocking thing I've learned in connection with my research, is that it happens that once in a while, a bystander will actually empathically co-live the dying life review of the person who's passing away. And that to me is shocking and mainly embarrassing. I mean, I'm hoping to recuse myself from my own life review anyway. And the idea that I would be watching something like that is shocking enough, but that there might be a spectator, is very disturbing.
I might be there at your life review.
That's right. And yet it happens. And for a long time, I thought that surely it must be that it would only occur to somebody who had an intimate knowledge of the person who was dying already. And yet a few years ago, my wife and I got a communication from an emergency room physician who was called to the emergency room to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And yet, as this man was dying, the physician himself was surrounded by this review of the man's life. So, life is so much more amazing than any of us imagine. And so that's what a shared death experience is, and they are very common.
I think it's so important that you use that, because for me, using metaphors, it's easier than talking about, but we need those words. So it's amazing that you do it. So where is the metaphor in your research meet you?
Well, I think that people use temporal and spatial metaphors a lot. As they say, I got out of my body and I went through a tunnel into the light, which is a spatial metaphor, but it comes within the framework of people saying that it wasn't in space anyway. And so, what you touch on there is, I think that one of the most astonishing things to me in this life is how many people just sort of walk through it without being curious about anything. Because as soon as you start thinking about this world, you quickly realize that this whole life is just something absolutely astonishing. You know, it's one of my favorite quotations about life and the nature of life comes from Elie Wiesel. And I read Elie Wiesel when I was a kid. And I was greatly influenced by his, in my thought process by Elie Wiesel. And at one point, Elie says, God made man because he loves stories. Life is story. And the only way we can keep from realizing that is because of the relentless tempo of life, where it just presents itself to us constantly and doesn't give us time to think about it. But I had a wonderful year as a geriatric psychiatrist talking in this town to the people who didn't want to be seen at the mental health clinic, right? Like the mayor or the chief of police or the people on the city council. Well, they can't go to the front door of the mental health clinic like the rest of us, like us peons. They've got to be sneaking the back door. And so since I was older, having gone through a PhD in philosophy before medical school, and also because I was known for my book, I was the one appointed for a year to sit in the office with these very, very articulate, very accomplished, brilliant people, and to talk to them about their situational stress, as it mostly was. And during that time, I heard pretty constantly elderly, reflective people say, Raymond, the older I get in my life, the more when I look back at it, it seems like it's been a story or a play. And it is. It's life is story. And so that's where I've come to anyway in my own thinking about this. It was a long time for me to come to realize that there is an afterlife. And it's still very counterintuitive to me.
I wanted to go back to your quote because you talked about stories, and I wanted to talk about the other part of the quote, which was about God. And I wanted to know what your thoughts are about the interaction with God. And also, I want to ask you, not only as a researcher, but as Raymond the person, about your relationship with God, and had it changed over the last, 50 so years while you've been doing all this research?
Well, my dad was, number one, a surgeon, and imagine that personality. And number two, a professional military officer, and imagine that personality. And so that was my dad. And he was a medic in World War II and the Pacific Theater. Okay, now, so when I was little, my dad was very sarcastic about religion. I didn't understand at the time, but now I can put together that, that generation didn't talk. And no doubt he saw such horrific things in the war that he just was turned off to religion. And my only person I knew in my life who was religious to any, but even then a minimal degree, was my Jewish aunt, Ruth, who was, she was, she seemed so old to me when I was a kid, but now I look back, she was just, not so much older than me. And, we were really good friends. And the rest of the family was just like my mother's mother was always kind of making humorous remarks about religion, not in any mean-spirited way, but it was just her favorite subject of humor. So I didn't really have any religious background. I mean, Ruth knew a little about, but, we didn't talk about that. And so then when my dad was setting up his practice, we went to a town in Georgia. I was 7 years old, where it was one of these places with the church on every corner. So as I put it together in retrospect, my dad was not well received by the establishment in town, except by the Jewish physicians who were okay with questions, right? So for some years there, I guess 5 or 6 years, all of our friends were Jewish, but they weren't religious either. We would talk about interesting things, but so it wasn't that I was an atheist. It was just that, I guess I sort of assumed when I was a kid that you can't know whether there's a God or not. That was the attitude I had. But when I started hearing from these people with near-death experiences, especially this Dr. George Ritchie, the first living person I heard talk about this was in 1965, and that feeling came through. And I'm still not religious, but through the process of my life development, what I say is I have a relationship with God. And, if somebody says to me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? I say, no, absolutely not, because number one, any belief that I could form about God, me, Raymond Moody, limited human being, would have to be off base in one direction or another, right? Plus, when you think of that sentence, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of the sentence is on the word exist. Now, I was a professor of logic. It'd take about an hour, but I could take you through and I could show you what the concept of existence means and even show you how to symbolize it. But when it comes to God, I give up. See, I think God is greater than existence. When people wonder whether God exists, they're trying to put God within a human concept, draw a line around God and call it existence. And that's ridiculous, because God doesn't care what I call God, I think. But I know that prayer, for example, I pray and things happen. It's and you feel the personal presence of God too. So I'm not religious, but I figure I talk to God several times a day, and I think if he had wanted me to be religious, he would have given me some indication of that by now. So
I want to ask Lisa a question. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the importance of giving spiritual guidance to people who are on the threshold.
What my experience has been, which is, relatively limited. I mean, there are hospice nurses who have tons of experience, but in the little bit of experience I've had, really the person who's dying offers us clues that will allow us to guide them based on their own internal spirituality, right? So to impose our spirituality on someone else, that's a mistake, because we all have very different ways. And as we die, for example, my father was a complete skeptic and atheist. And then as he was dying, he saw angels in the room, which was something completely new and different. So, more it was about talking to him about the angels in the room. So the guidance is about being in communication with the person. Someone may say, one guy was, I have a boxer in the room with me. He loved professional boxing. Instead of saying, wait a minute, where's God? You're supposed to be seeing God now, Instead, it's tell me about the boxer. What does the boxer have to tell you? And then once that person gets into conversation with the boxer, all kinds of things began to open. So I think we do not really know, except for those who've maybe had near-death experiences. But those of us who haven't crossed the threshold, I really have no idea who or what God is. I have some really good guesses, or what spirituality is. So I feel like with the dying, it's more about engaging in conversation and imagination as they are dying. So they'll say things. So for example, another example, my father actually had a pencil in his hand, and he was putting it on his, like here, and he's saying, I'm trying to get the pencil to the other side. And at the time, I didn't know anything about language. I hadn't done this research into language and dying. So I was like, Dad, put the pencil down. You're hurting yourself. But now what I would say, the pencil want to go to the other side. Tell me about the other side. What's the pencil telling you? So someone might say, oh my God, your dad, it's nonsense. He's delirious. He's talking about pencils to the other side. So for me, the spiritual guidance is about having an ear tuned to the language, not judging the language, not saying something is nonsense or bad or any of those, because we have so many judgments about nonsense. Raymond calls that the nonsense taboo. But actually, all the language people say as they are dying are giving us opportunities to deepen their spirituality and oftentimes deepen our own. So I'll say one more thing about that. But a lot of people start talking about travel or trips. They'll say things like, I need my passport, or where's the car, or where's the train? And again, you could say, oh God, Grandpa, you're just crazy, or you've had too much medication. Or you can say, where's the train going? How is the train? Or I'll find your passport. And then you can see what their story is.
Can you tell us about an Nde story that was like very profound?
Well, in a way, they're all profound. But I keep going back to the first one I heard because the man he was the professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, Dr. George Ritchie. And to this day, George was just the finest human being I ever knew. And he was, he suffered a cardiac arrest. He was without a heartbeat for at least 9 minutes. They don't know how long he had been in that state before they found him. But just the fact of the love that came across and the profound transformation. But I think they're all, they're all wonderful. And it seems that the people who have the most lengthy cardiac arrests are most prone to get into these very involved ones, the very, very lengthy ones and so on. So some of the most memorable ones to me are the ones where the cardiac arrest went on for times that are just inconceivable. Like one of my best friends that I got to know through her experience, her cardiac arrest was documented to last 40 minutes. And her physicians brought her back not for a medical reason, but for a purely personal reason. It was that he said that he couldn't bring himself to tell this woman's daughter that she was dead. Mm-hmm. So he said, well, I'm going to try again. And when he tried again, he said the woman came back with a laugh. And the experience she had was just phenomenal. So, I have thousands of these I've heard, and I can't wait to hear the next one. I mean, they're all, they kind of transport you into some other state of consciousness.
Are there common characteristics of near-death experiences? And if so, what are some of them that are very common?
I think of it as a family resemblance, which is that in the ones I've interviewed, there's about 15 or 20 common elements that occur. And one person may have 2 or 3 or 4 of these, or 5 or 6 or 8, or some of them have the full-blown picture. And it seems to correlate fairly nicely with how close to death they got. Whereas people with these extremely lengthy cardiac arrests are more likely to tell you the full-blown picture. But of the things that are more commonly reported is that people say that when their heart stops beating, they hear the doctor say something like, oh my God, he's dead, or we've lost her, or words to that effect. But they say from their point of view that statement seems ridiculous, because I hear people say all the time something like, I've never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead. But they say that they leave their physical bodies, they go up, they seem to watch the scene of the resuscitation from above. They say that they no longer hear a physical voice, but they become aware of what the doctors and nurses are thinking. And that they enter into a state of consciousness that no matter how articulate they are, they say they just can't describe it. But the way they try to describe it is they say that they go through a passageway of some sort, which they may characterize as a hallway or a tube or a tunnel, and they come out on the other side of the tunnel into this incredibly brilliant light, far brighter than anything that we experienced as light while we're alive, and yet which is, they say that you could just as well call it love, that this light of love, and they feel comforted in this light. They see relatives or friends of theirs who have already passed away, seem to be there in spirit form, as they say. They undergo panoramic holographic memory, in which everything they've ever done is displayed around them instantly in a sort of hologram. They see everything they've ever done, and time stands still. And they say that in this vision, they remember each event of their life, but when they experience it, they are empathically embedded in the consciousness of the person with whom they've interacted. So that if you see yourself in this panorama doing something unkind to someone, then you feel the hurt that you brought about in that person's life. Or if you see yourself doing a kind-hearted action, you feel the good feeling that you brought about. And so for this reason, people who come back from this saying that whatever they have been chasing in their life, I have spent my life chasing knowledge. Some people chase money or power or fame or any of these other things, but whatever they were chasing before, they say that they realized through this experience that what this is all about is trying to learn to love. And by the way, nobody says that they feel like they got up to that point, you know, that it's still a process, right? And then they say they come back. Some people say they have no idea how they got back. They were just in that light, and then next instant they were in their physical bodies again with no sense of transition. Some people say that they were told either by God or an angel or a spirit that, or one of their deceased relatives, that it wasn't their time to die yet. They had to go back because they had things left to do. And then a third group say that they were given a choice, that they could either go on with the experience they were having then, or could return to the life they had been leading. And not too surprisingly, all the ones that I've talked with chose to come back, right? But the interesting thing is that almost always the reason is that they have young children left to raise. It's always on behalf of someone else. It can be another relative or a friend or whatever they go back with, but most commonly in my experiences, they choose to go back. They say for themselves they would rather have stayed in the light, but they chose to come back, usually because of their children.
I heard in one of your interviews you called the body home. But then, usually what they say when they go out of the body is, this is my original state. This is my home.
Yes,
here outside.
That's right. People very quickly lose interest in the body. It just becomes a sort of curiosity. Very often, they don't recognize it as their body. They have to sort of figure out, oh, that must be my body. But as you say, people say that they immediately realize that the focus is yourself, your consciousness, and the body is, as in the Platonic, I guess, point of view of it, is that it's a vehicle or a garment, which you quickly lose interest in when you are out of your body.
Can you comment about the after effects and the integration back into the body based on your research?
Well, the most common thing is that whatever they were chasing before, people say that, they realize that the focus here has to be on learning to love, but it is still very difficult. Dr. Ritchie himself told me one time he didn't use these words, but it's my translation. In effect, what he was saying was that even after this, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? And that stays. You still have flashes of hostility and say things you didn't wish you hadn't have said, but that the point is that you come back on this quest to learn how to love, which people absolutely do. I've observed that for a long time. Another thing is the loss of fear of death. People say that this experience convinces them that what we call death is a transition into another reality, so they no longer fear death. Another occasional after effect is a intensification of the desire to learn. I've had a lot of people say that during their life review, that when some scene emerges in which they had been learning something, that this being that they are with, this being of light, sort of focuses in on that. And although there are no words, the thought comes that even after you die, this process of learning will go on forever. And then another occasional after effect is that someone who has never had any interest at all in art will, become an artist. And I saw this in Toronto 30 years ago. This one woman who had never had any interest in art, but after her near-death experience, she was inspired to become a painter and was, at that time, an award-winning artist in Toronto. And more recently in the United States, a wonderful man, Dr. Anthony Chakoria, is a PhD in physiology and an MD and a distinguished professor of orthopedic surgery at NYU. And some years ago at a family reunion, Tony was hit in the neck by a bolt of lightning and had a cardiac arrest and got out of his body and went around to the family reunion and was able to describe what people were doing in his family, even though his body was back at the scene of the lightning strike. And after this, Tony, who had never had any interest in music, unaccountably developed a interest in the piano and started taking piano lessons and got a piano. And he kept having this recurrent dream in which he was playing a piece on a concert stage on a piano. So he learned how to transcribe music, and he transcribed this music. And now, in addition to being an eminent professor of orthopedic surgery, he's also a concert pianist. So
you hear about NDEers that get information, even information about their future. So maybe that's what happened when he had this recurring dream.
Yeah, I've seen those. I've had quite a number of people who had flash forwards during their near-death experience. Once in a while, it's rare, but I've heard it, that people in their near-death experience saw things that were going to happen in the future to them. So.
Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about people who have these moments of lucidity before they are passing?
It's called terminal lucidity. That's one of the terms. And they're one of the most dramatic cases that I researched that's in my book is a gentleman described how his mother, she did actually have Alzheimer's, and then she was in a coma on top of it. So they really hadn't had a conversation that made much sense for a few years. And then, of course, she was in a coma. And right before she died, she came out and looked at him and completely lucidly said to him, "John, I want to let you know where all the financial files are. And she said on the drawer, upstairs in my study, and she went under this description that turned out to be completely accurate. Now that is probably the most dramatic one in my, of the ones that I've researched. But there was this, after this woman for many years was not sensical or hard to understand, there was this period of lucidity. But in most cases, people have a kind of a short window of lucidity. And many times those are the times that people will say, I never told you how much I love you, or maybe certain little bits of advice, like make sure our granddaughter gets guitar lessons, or, those little pieces, but usually they're words of forgiveness. They're very rarely angry words or anything like that. And sometimes there'll be something very kind of enigmatic, like one woman came out of her coma and said, "It's not what you think." Right. And people weren't sure, but she came up out of the coma, just sort of sat up in her bed, seemed a little lighter, said that, then went back and then died a few hours later. So, and sometimes they also call them sunset days. And for some people, it's just a matter of minutes. For other people, it could actually be a full, maybe many hours or a full day that occurs. It's a big mystery that's finally only now being researched more. And I guess, Raymond, you have the term fae. You've described the word fae, I believe.
That was something I discovered by chance in the Oxford Dictionary years ago. But fae, F-E-Y, is a word that was very common in the 19th century. And the sort of core meaning of it is a state of heightened consciousness that portends imminent death. And this was very well understood in the Victorian era, for example, when people died at home, and everybody was there. But then the word sort of dropped down. And because in the United States in the 1930s, people started dying in hospitals. So the idea sort of dropped out, but it's plainly what we call today terminal lucidity. And it's certainly something you see in hospitals when, I dealt a lot with terminally ill patients, and it was just a fairly common thing that I would go into the ward in the morning, and the relatives of the dying person would be very happy because, oh, grandma's going to be all right because, she's awake now and she's better than ever. And, you have to tell the family, no, that's sort of a sign that they're going to be exiting pretty soon.
Is there any ear that you met that told you, I know the future of the humanity, or so the COVID-19? You met somebody like that?
I absolutely did. And back in the 70s, I met 3 or 4 people who said that in their visions, in their near-death experiences, they had seen that the year 1988 and 89 were very calamitous. One man even said that he saw that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And I remember specifically what I thought about at that time, because I watched the news and it looked to me that things were heading up to a very bad calamity. And so I just assumed this was that their minds were racing ahead. But I will admit that when in 1989 the Soviet Union collapsed, as these people had told me, in the early 70s, that was really quite startling. I could imagine, seeing that things were getting bad, but to get that specific, that was startling.
Do you think there is a meaning, like a purpose that God made all those Andy ears?
I do. What do you think? I do.
I certainly wouldn't be surprised to learn that, but I don't know. The question being, I guess, is God sending our awareness of these things now because something is very big in the works? And But I don't know, but I know that something big is in the works just from reading the newspaper, right? It's like, this can't go on like it's going now. This is, you know, anybody who is good at extrapolation in any way will realize that things are headed very rapidly to some sort of huge, out of control event.
Climax.
That's right. So, but I don't know whether God is taking a personal hand in it or not. But you know, see, as an astronomy buff, the most recent count and most accurate account of the number of stars in the known universe is 150 billion trillion. Now, from the Kepler and other research, we know that practically all of those stars have planets around them, right?
Yes.
And as a very conservative estimate from the Kepler, it seems that about 1 out of 1,000 planets is Earth-like. And so let's assume that the sun is very far out on the right end of the bell curve and having 8, but the average star has only, say, 4, okay? Well, that's 600 billion trillion planets in the known universe. And given that 1 out of 1,000 of them is Earth-like, that means that in the known universe, there's on the order of 1 billion trillion Earths. Now, to me, that shows even more about God, that out of all of that, every one of us here in this meeting and all the people all over the world can have a personal relationship with God. And that is just astonishing, you know. I mean, God is so far beyond what any of us can conceive, and yet there is that personal contact too. So this world is, I mean, it's just totally incomprehensible.
In one of the interviews, you were talking with students, and you were talking about knowledge and how to define knowledge, and you showed them that they have their own conception. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about this?
One of my favorite areas of philosophy is epistemology, and that's the theory of knowledge. During my epistemology classes, the first couple of days of class, I would just ask my students, what do you think knowledge is? And so if you will just trust me thus far, in modern society, if you ask that question to a random group of students, what they're going to come up with is, oh, knowledge is science, right? That's what most people come up with. And so then I say, well, tell me more what you mean. And so what eventually they come up with is that scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, right? That's what most people believe. And that point of view is called scientism, right? And so I would say, and I would write that statement up on the board. Scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge. And then I would ask them, is that what you think? And so in modern America anyway, that most students, yeah, that's what I think. So then I would draw a rectangle around that statement, and I would say, well, how do you know that?
Right.
Now, there's only 2 answers they can give. One, they can say, I know it by scientific method, but that's called reasoning in a circle. It's assuming what you've set out to prove. If, however, they say scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, and I know that by philosophy or history or literary theory or the law, then that's a self-contradiction. So my point here is that scientific method is not and cannot be the only rational means of securing knowledge. And in connection with the afterlife question, what I've always said in 2021, life after death is not yet a scientific question. But it's still a philosophical question, and a very important philosophical question. And what I say is that the breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death is, we have made a breakthrough, but I think it's not yet a scientific question. And that was the point, I think, of what you were talking about, is that, to address this question of life after death is going to require us to get outside of our customary frames of reference. One of my favorite philosopher of the 18th century was David Hume, who was the great skeptic, who said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. And he said, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And so what he was getting at is that the mind we have and the logic we have are not sufficient for proving the afterlife. So that has always been assumed to mean that it's impossible. But I say that Hume's problem has been solved. But I think that we're in a situation now where we absolutely can move forward in this biggest question of existence.
We're using the words soul, consciousness, light. Do you know what's the difference between them?
I give up on that one because, the question is personal identity, right? Like, what is it that constitutes our personal identity? And the question goes way back in philosophy, but it was Plato who really sort of came up with the standard notion of the soul in the West, like the immaterial, immortal soul. Although Pythagoras, he got part of that from Pythagoras, but then in the 16th century, people began to realize that there's something conceptually incoherent about the notion of the soul, an immaterial substance. So there were all kinds of attempts to make sense of it. John Locke identified the personal identity with one's memories and so on. And also, I think your consciousness is narrative directed. It's there's a principle in cinematography. I forgot the man who first realized it, but cinematographers have learned that if you present any two random images in succession to a person, then the mind immediately starts creating a narrative to join those two images. And that is how consciousness works. It's like whatever new event comes up in your life, you create you add that event into your life story. Yeah, you finish up one story, and then, as I gather, you go through this incomprehensible process, and then you're back on another storyline.
Do you think that there is a correlation between the state of consciousness of a person and the type of near-death experience that
they have? I don't know, but I think another thing that I would start thinking about when I ask myself that question is whether it is a matter of words as well. It's whether people are having the same experience, but that due to their linguistic apparatus, they can only articulate it one way. I don't know.
It does seem with certain illnesses that when someone is still in their body more. I can't find another way, but it seems, I've noticed that with different illnesses, people seem to be more in the kind of hellish states, or in the beginning of the NDE, like there may be some relationship, not necessarily the person's consciousness, but more what the illness was and how they got sick and how they died or are dying. That's one thing I've seen, some kind of relationship. Does that make sense? That it may have more.
It does. You know, I have heard so few negative experiences that I don't have a big enough number to make any inference about them is the trouble. I mean, now why that is, I don't know. Maybe I don't have the kind of face that somebody would be comfortable telling a negative experience. Although against that is the fact that I was a forensic psychiatrist and talking mostly every day, on the average day, I would talk with 10 or 15 psychotic killers, and they didn't seem to have any difficult talking. What occurs to me is that there might be an underreporting of negative experiences. I don't know, but I mean, personally, I think I would feel more reluctant to say, Doc, when I died, I went to hell.
Do you think that depending on the depth of the NDE, that, for example, let's say the border, and there is like a border that people cross, do people have to be more severe? I mean, what's the relationship? There are certain stages and steps in the NDE.
Maybe the question is, can we measure the depth of the NDE?
That's my sense.
What I am convinced from my experience that the closer somebody gets to death, as a general rule, the further into this experience they get. That is that someone who has only a momentary cardiac arrest is more likely to tell you of one or two or three of these things, whereas people with these impossibly lengthy cardiac arrests that go on for 40 minutes or an hour, they're much more likely to tell you of this whole full-blown picture. However, there are exceptions to that, but as a general rule, the closer somebody gets to death, the more of these elements that they report.
Can you tell us a little bit about NDEs that happened after trying
attempted
suicide?
Yeah, I've had quite a number of those over the years, and they don't seem to differ in quality from people who have near-death experiences for other reasons. And with the exception that almost invariably people who tell me that I would never attempt it again. As they say, they realize they would have had to have watched the suffering that their action had brought about in the lives of their loved ones. And also because, as I've heard repeatedly, a number of people have said they realized it would be kind of like walking out in the middle of the movie, that you don't know how the movie would have come out. The main thing that comes out of people who tell me about near-death experiences related to suicide attempts is they wouldn't try it again, not because of any fear of hell, but because of the movie aspect. I would have been left in suspense, like what would have happened next, or that I would have had to see the impact that my action had on my loved ones and the guilt and so on. So
we talk about words, final words, words of threshold. That's your books. It feels like that we just don't understand each other. So the words and the meaning, it's so important. And we have a vision here in Iands Israel. We want to take all this information of all the end years and to find like a social doctrine, to take all those insights from the other realm and to take it down to this earthly life by words, meaning, the same words and the same meaning, having the language of the heart, because all the end years, they say the same thing, maybe in different metaphors, but it's the language of the heart. And Do you think it's possible?
You know, that's a very interesting thought. And I think it's a vast project. There would have to be all sorts of different elements of it. But one that comes to my mind is that I do think it's very important for people to break through this mental barrier most of us have to the unintelligible. Because nonsense has not just been used for amusement, like with Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss we have here in the United States, or other nonsense poets, but it's also been part of the spiritual traditions of many societies. You think of koans, for example. What is the sound of one hand clapping, which is a nonsense question. So in terms of that, well, I guess what you're sort of thinking there is a general transformation of the mind of humanity. And I don't have the whole picture, but I think that one aspect of it would be to open up our minds to the unintelligible domain of language. And I mean, I've seen that happen. I've taught courses on this for, well, going back to 1969, and I've just had students again and again tell me that they feel their minds have been transformed by what they learned about nonsense. And guys, I'm really, really embarrassed here because I don't want to look like I'm a book salesman or something. I really don't. But I mean, in terms of that question, I do have this book, which, and you can cut this part out if you want to when you broadcast this, because I don't want to seem like I'm, you know, trying to sell a book. I'm really not. But this is my book on, it's called Making Sense of Nonsense. And it consists, it's basically all the material I taught in my courses over the years. And there are exercises in it where the students would learn how to write different types of nonsense, and then they would introspect. And it's had very powerful impacts on my students. So I think that would be one kind of thing that we can. David Hume said, you know, the minds we have and the logic we have won't do to comprehend the afterlife. But I think now that we can get around that, we absolutely can come up with a new logic, and which then opens up different faculties of our mind. And that would be one part of the project that you're talking about. I think there could be, you know, that have to be many other aspects as well, but it's, we don't just need to be, just to sit passively and talk about how the afterlife is incomprehensible. We can actually take an active hand and alter our own minds in such a way as to become closer to this, to a genuine rational comprehension of this most important question of existence to me is there life after death?
And, you know, I think of language as being like clothing. You know, it's really beautiful and it's fun to wear, and, you know, and it does all sorts of things for us. It's practical. But, you know, if we believe we're the clothes we're wearing, we're in trouble. We are not the clothes we are wearing. The clothes we are wearing are useful and they're beautiful. And I think, you know, in a lot of meditation practices, you know, you breathe, you do deep breathing, you know, like I do some I meditate, and you realize you have all these thoughts, and that's not who we are as eternal beings. And language is wonderful. I'm a linguist. I've spent years studying. I'm a poet. I love language. But when we start getting attached to our words and ideas as being the only truths, you know, there is something beyond language, which is what I feel is the truth. Now, what's tricky is how do we all agree on what that truth is? But language is, you know, Raymond's work is so important, because when we realize that a part of language is being nonsensical, this is not me.
Yeah.
It's an expression of who I am. It's an expression. But if I were to say to Gila, this is better than what you're wearing, and this is the only kind of thing you should wear, then we're in trouble, right? But still, what I wear is beautiful, what you wear is beautiful. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I love language, but it also can be a weapon of destruction. And what Raymond offers us, which is so brilliant, and that's why he's my mentor as well as my friend, that language unintelligibility is part of the human experience. And if we realize that language is completely, can be completely nonsensical, we won't get attached to it. And so Raymond in so many ways offers us so many gifts. And one of them is to realize that language can make sense and it can also not make sense. So we have to be able to not be so attached to the words we say. And there is something else that unifies us. It's much more eternal because language, like clothing, is is variable and changes.
Like a gate, the words, like a gate to get to.
Yeah,
this
that's right.
connection between us, and like what you do with the University of Heaven. While I listened to you, I said, okay, let's make all the University of Heaven. Like, let's study and work together about those meanings, and we will have heaven here, It's not up there, like the conscious, it's all inside. So your answers are beautiful. For the end, what do you think about playing a game?
Association game, yeah. Light.
Well, what comes into my mind is love, but it's probably because of the conversation we had earlier.
Infinite.
Art.
Goya. Because he's my favorite artist.
Beauty.
God.
Love again.
Resolution.
Okay. Music.
Elvis.
Dance.
Time.
Unreality.
Selfish.
Children.
Carter and Carol Ann.
Dear.
Beautiful. You are both so dear, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. This has just been great fun.
Yeah, really.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.